Bella Hope nearly dropped the pot of begonias when her phone rang for the 10th time that Tuesday morning. "Hello," she answered breathlessly, trying to balance 3 petunia seedlings in her left arm while holding the cell phone with her shoulder. "Miss Hope, this is Cordelia Whitmore from Whitmore Elite Domestic Services Agency." Bella frowned. Elite? She could barely afford the rent on her tiny studio apartment in Queens, let alone hire an elite agency. "I think you have the wrong person, ma'am. I'm a landscaper, I'm definitely not elite anything." "On the contrary, dear, you're exactly who we're looking for." Cordelia's voice sounded like expensive champagne being poured into crystal flutes. "Your work at the Manhattan Botanical Garden caught our attention. Specifically, how you brought that century-old rosebush back from the dead when everyone else had given up on it." Bella's heart skipped a beat. That rosebush had been her most beloved project, 3 months nurturing apparently dead branches until, miraculously, it bloomed again with red roses the size of closed fists. "Mr. Robert Storm needs a landscaper for his estate in the Hamptons. 3 months of work, housing included, and—" Cordelia paused dramatically. $50,000. Bella dropped the petunias on the floor. $50,000? She repeated, her voice cracking. "For 3 months? Mr. Storm is very particular about his garden. Let's say the last 7 landscapers couldn't meet his expectations." 7 landscapers. Bella swallowed hard. What exactly did this Robert guy want? A garden that grew gold instead of flowers? "Can I ask why the others didn't work out?" "Oh dear." Cordelia laughed, a crystalline sound that didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Storm is a man of vision. He wants his garden to be transcendent. Unfortunately, not everyone can handle intense personalities." Intense personalities sounded like code for impossible man. But $50,000 meant Bella could finally open her own flower shop, pay off all the medical bills her mom had left behind, and still have enough for a decent future. "When do I start?" "Tomorrow at 8 a.m. sharp. A driver will pick you up." "And Miss Hope?" Cordelia's voice took on a warning tone. "Mr. Storm values punctuality above all else, and he prefers his staff to be invisible." Invisible. Of course he did. The next morning, Bella stood on the sidewalk at 7:45 a.m. with her patched rolling suitcase and a box of gardening tools she'd inherited from her grandmother. The driver, a silent man in a black suit, didn't even get out to help her with the luggage. During the hour-long drive, Bella pressed her face to the tinted window of the black sedan, watching as the urban landscape gave way to increasingly impressive mansions. When they finally stopped in front of wrought iron gates that looked like they'd been taken from a medieval castle, she had to catch her breath. The Storm estate wasn't just big. It was majestic in a way that made it clear money was no object for its owner. 3 stories of gray stone, enormous arched windows, cylindrical towers on the sides, and above all, gardens that stretched as far as the eye could see. Gardens that, Bella realized with growing horror, were completely dead. Not just neglected, dead. As if someone had poured salt or poison everywhere. The century-old trees were somber skeletons, the flower beds were graveyards of withered roses, and what must have once been a lush lawn now looked like a grayish-green desert. "My God," she murmured, getting out of the car. "What happened here?" "Miss Hope, I presume." Bella turned around so fast she almost tripped over her own luggage. At the main entrance of the mansion stood a man who looked like he'd stepped directly off the cover of a men's magazine, and not one of those cheap magazines she sometimes flipped through at the grocery store. Robert Storm was tall, absurdly well-dressed even at 8 in the morning, with perfectly styled black hair and amber eyes that seemed to see right through people's souls. He was also frowning in a way that suggested Bella had already failed some invisible test. "Mr. Storm?" she managed to say, extending her hand. "I'm Bella Hope." He looked at her hand like it was a poisonous snake. "Mrs. Whitmore informed me you were competent." His voice was deep, with a slight accent she couldn't identify. I hope she's correct. The last 7 attempts were disappointing. About that. Bella gestured toward what remained of the garden. What exactly happened here? It looks like someone declared war on plants. Robert's golden eyes narrowed. I declared war on plants, Miss Hope. Or rather, on the wrong plants. Bella blinked. What do you mean? Follow me. He turned and walked back toward the mansion without checking if she was following. You need to understand exactly what I expect from you. Bella dragged her luggage up the marble steps, trying not to notice how her worn sneakers squeaked against the pristine floor. The mansion's interior was even more impressive than the exterior. Impossibly high ceilings, crystal chandeliers that probably cost more than her 5-year salary, and artwork on the walls she was sure she'd seen in books. Robert led her through a long corridor until they reached an office that looked more like a private library. The walls were covered with books from floor to ceiling. There was an ornately carved marble fireplace, and behind a mahogany desk that could serve as a landing strip for small planes, a panoramic window offered a complete view of the devastated garden. Sit, he ordered, gesturing to a leather chair in front of the desk. Bella sat, placing the toolbox in her lap, since she didn't know where else to put it. Miss Hope, do you have any experience with emotional gardening? Emotional gardening? Plants that respond to feelings, flowers that bloom only when there's true love nearby, trees that wither in the presence of lies. Robert watched her intensely, as if evaluating her mental stability. Gardens that reflect the emotional state of their caretakers. Bella stared at him for a long moment. Mr. Storm, are you talking about magic plants? I'm talking about advanced horticulture based on emotional energy, Miss Hope. And if you're going to be here for the next 3 months trying to resurrect this garden, you need to understand that conventional methods won't work. The silence that followed was broken only by the tick-tock of a grandfather clock somewhere in the house. Bella looked out the window at the botanical graveyard outside, then back at the impossible man sitting in front of her, and finally at her perfectly normal box of gardening tools. $50,000, she reminded herself. $50,000 to deal with a billionaire who believed in emotional plants. All right, she said finally. Let's save your magic garden. For the first time since she'd met him, Robert Storm almost smiled. Almost. Robert stood and walked to a massive bookshelf, pulling out what appeared to be a leather-bound journal thick as a phone book. When he dropped it on the desk with a heavy thud, dust particles danced in the morning sunlight streaming through the windows. Your predecessor's notes, he said curtly. Jessica left very detailed observations about why conventional gardening failed here. Bella opened the journal and immediately wished she hadn't. The first page was covered in frantic handwriting that grew increasingly erratic as it progressed. Day 1. Planted standard rose varieties. Mr. Storm seemed displeased. Day 3. Roses are wilting despite perfect soil conditions and adequate water. Day 7. Tried different fertilizers. Nothing works. Mr. S. Watching from window constantly. Day 12. Plants are dying faster now. What is wrong with this place? Day 18. I think the garden hates me. The entries continued for 2 more weeks before ending abruptly with, can't take it anymore. The man is impossible, and this place is cursed. Jessica lasted longer than most, Robert commented, apparently reading over Bella's shoulder. Marcus quit after 5 days, said I was emotionally toxic to plant life. Bella looked up at him. Are you? The question hung in the air like morning fog. Robert's amber eyes flickered with something, surprise, hurt, annoyance, before his expression returned to its default setting of aristocratic indifference. That's what we're here to find out, isn't it? Before Bella could respond, a woman appeared in the doorway carrying a silver tray. She was probably in her 60s, with silver hair pulled into a neat bun and the kind of warm smile that immediately made Bella feel welcome. Your tea, Mr. Storm, and you must be the new gardener. She set the tray down and extended her hand to Bella. I'm Mrs. Henderson, the housekeeper. Though around here, I'm more like a referee between Robert and Mother Nature. It's nice to meet you, Bella said, genuinely relieved to encounter someone normal in this bizarre situation. I'm Bella Hope. Hope, Mrs. Henderson repeated thoughtfully. What a lovely name. We could use some of that around here. Aye, she shot a meaningful look at Robert, who was pointedly ignoring the conversation while flipping through papers. Mrs. Henderson has been with the family for 20 years, Robert said without looking up. She's also the only staff member who hasn't threatened to quit because of my impossible personality. That's because I remember you when you were 12 and cried for a week after your pet goldfish died, Mrs. Henderson replied cheerfully. Hard to be intimidated by someone you've seen in dinosaur pajamas. Bella bit back a laugh as Robert's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Mrs. Henderson will show you to your quarters, he said stiffly. We'll begin tomorrow at dawn. Dawn? Bella squeaked. Like actual sunrise dawn? Plants are most receptive to emotional energy in the early morning hours, Robert replied, as if this were a well-known scientific fact. 5:30 a.m. sharp. As Mrs. Henderson led her through the mansion's labyrinthine hallways, Bella caught glimpses of rooms that looked like museum exhibits, a ballroom with a ceiling painted like the Sistine Chapel, a dining room with a table that could seat 30, a conservatory filled with exotic but notably unhealthy-looking plants. Don't mind him, Mrs. Henderson said quietly as they climbed a grand staircase. He's been like this ever since. Well, since the incident. What incident? Mrs. Henderson paused on the landing, glancing around as if checking for eavesdroppers. 3 years ago, Robert was engaged to a woman named Vivian. Beautiful, sophisticated, everything you'd expect for someone of his status. The wedding was supposed to be here, in the garden. 500 guests, celebrity wedding planner, the works. They continued walking, but Bella's attention was fully captured. What happened? The night before the wedding, Vivian called it off. Said she realized she was marrying him for his money, not for love, and she couldn't go through with it. Very noble of her, really, but the timing was… Mrs. Henderson shook her head. Robert was devastated, and the garden, well, it's been dying ever since. They stopped in front of a door at the end of a long hallway. Your room, Mrs. Henderson said, opening it to reveal a space that was larger than Bella's entire apartment back in Queens. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the dead garden. A king-size bed dominated one wall, and there was even a small sitting area with a fireplace. This is incredible, Bella breathed. The previous landscapers all said the same thing. Of course, they also all ran screaming after 2 weeks. Mrs. Henderson's expression grew serious. Bella, I like you already, and I hope you'll stay. But you should know, Robert isn't just difficult because he's rich and demanding. He's difficult because he's heartbroken. And somehow he's convinced himself that if he can make this garden bloom again, it'll prove he's capable of real love. Bella sank onto the edge of the enormous bed. So I'm not just supposed to resurrect some plants. I'm supposed to fix his emotional trauma through horticulture? Stranger things have happened, Mrs. Henderson said with a shrug. Though I'll admit, not many. After Mrs. Henderson left, Bella unpacked her meager belongings, which looked almost comically small in the vast room. She hung her 3 decent shirts in a walk-in closet that could house a small family and placed her worn gardening boots next to the fireplace. The afternoon sun was streaming through the windows, casting long shadows across the garden outside. From this height, she could see the full extent of the damage. Acres of dead grass, skeletal fruit trees, flower beds that looked like abandoned graveyards. But there was something else. A structure in the center of it all that she hadn't noticed from ground level. A gazebo, white and elegant, surrounded by what had once been a rose garden. Even from here she could see withered vines clinging to its pillars like desperate fingers. That must have been where the wedding was supposed to happen. Bella pressed her palm against the cool window glass. $50,000 to bring a garden back to life. $50,000 to somehow heal a broken man's heart through the language of flowers. She'd certainly had easier jobs. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called. To her surprise, Robert stood in the doorway, looking oddly uncertain. He'd changed from his morning suit into dark jeans and a simple white button-down, which somehow made him look younger and less intimidating. "I wanted to clarify expectations," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Mrs. Henderson mentioned she told you about Vivian." Bella nodded. "She did. I don't want you to think this is some sort of therapy session disguised as landscaping. I simply believe that emotional energy affects plant growth, and I want to test the theory scientifically." "Scientifically," Bella repeated. "Yes. With magic plants." Robert's jaw tightened. "With plants that are sensitive to the emotional environment of their caretakers." "Right." Bella stood up, crossing her arms. "And if your theory is correct, and the garden is dying because you're heartbroken, what exactly do you expect me to do about it? I'm a landscaper, not a therapist." For a long moment, Robert just stared at her. Then, unexpectedly, he almost smiled. The same almost smile from that morning, but warmer somehow. "Maybe," he said quietly. "You're exactly what this place needs." Before Bella could ask what he meant by that, he was gone, leaving her alone with the impossible task ahead and the strangest feeling that she'd just agreed to much more than 3 months of gardening. Outside her window, the dead garden waited in the fading light, keeping its secrets. Bella's alarm went off at 5 a.m., which felt like cruel and unusual punishment after a night spent tossing and turning in a bed that was probably worth more than her annual salary. She stumbled to the window and peered out at the pre-dawn darkness, where she could just make out Robert's silhouette standing motionless in the center of the dead garden like some sort of brooding statue. "This is insane," she muttered, pulling on her work clothes. "I'm about to practice emotional gardening with a billionaire who thinks plants have feelings." But $50,000 was $50,000, and crazy rich people had paid for stranger things. She'd once read about a tech mogul who hired someone full-time just to argue with him about movies. At least plants couldn't argue back. 20 minutes later, she emerged from the mansion carrying her toolbox and a thermos of coffee that Mrs. Henderson had mysteriously left outside her door. Robert was exactly where she'd seen him from the window, standing in what had once been the rose garden surrounding the gazebo. Up close, the devastation was even worse. The gazebo itself was beautiful, white painted wood with intricate Victorian details. But the climbing roses that should have adorned it were brown, twisted skeletons. The ground around it was littered with dead petals that crunched under her feet like autumn leaves. "You're 3 minutes late," Robert said without turning around. "Good morning to you too, sunshine." Bella set down her toolbox with perhaps more force than necessary. "So, where do we start with this magical plant resurrection?" Robert finally turned to face her, and Bella was surprised to see that he looked like he hadn't slept at all. His usually perfect hair was slightly disheveled, and there were dark circles under his amber eyes. "We start," he said, "with honesty." "Okay." Bella took a sip of her coffee, which was absolutely perfect, and probably cost more per pound than her rent. "I'll be honest. I think you're either crazy or the world's most elaborate practical joker. But I need this job, so I'm willing to play along with whatever botanical voodoo you have in mind." Instead of being offended, Robert looked almost relieved. "That's more honesty than I've gotten from anyone in 3 years," he said quietly. "The others all pretended to believe in emotional gardening because they thought it's what I wanted to hear. And is it? I don't know what I want to hear anymore." He ran a hand through his hair, making it even messier. "I only know that 7 landscapers have tried conventional methods here, and nothing works. The soil tests are perfect. The drainage is ideal. The climate conditions are optimal. And yet—" He gestured helplessly at the botanical graveyard surrounding them. Bella knelt down and picked up a handful of soil, letting it run through her fingers. It was rich, dark, and perfectly balanced, exactly the kind of earth that should have plants fighting each other to grow in it. Tell me about Vivian, she said suddenly. Robert went very still. Mrs. Henderson had no right. Mrs. Henderson cares about you, Bella interrupted, standing and dusting off her hands. And if we're going to do this, if we're really going to try to save this garden, I need to understand what happened here. For a long moment, Robert just stared at her. Then, unexpectedly, he sat down on the gazebo steps, like the weight of the world had suddenly become too much to bear. We were together for 2 years, he said finally. She was everything I thought I wanted. Beautiful, intelligent, from a good family. She fit perfectly into my world. But, Bella prompted, sitting down beside him. But the night before our wedding, she told me she'd been pretending the entire time, that she'd convinced herself she could learn to love me for who I was, not what I had, but she realized she couldn't go through with marrying someone she didn't truly love. His voice was so quiet, Bella had to strain to hear it. She said I was a good man, but I was also cold and distant, and she deserved to marry someone who made her feel alive. Bella winced. Ouch. The worst part was that she was right. Robert picked up a dead rose petal and crumbled it between his fingers. I never let anyone close enough to really know me. I thought if I could just provide enough luxury, enough security, that would be enough. But love doesn't work that way, does it? No, Bella said softly. It doesn't. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the sun slowly rise over the dead garden. Then Bella stood up and clapped her hands together. All right, enough wallowing. If your theory is correct and this garden is dying because of emotional trauma, then we need to start pumping some positive energy into this place. And how exactly do you propose we do that? Bella grinned. We're going to start small. One plant, one honest conversation at a time. She walked over to what had once been a rose bush and knelt beside it, examining the withered stems. This one's not completely dead, she announced. See these tiny green buds near the base? There's still life in there. Robert joined her, crouching down to see what she was pointing at. Those could just be weeds. Could be, or they could be new growth. Bella looked up at him, their faces suddenly much closer than she'd realized. Tell me something real about yourself. Something you've never told anyone else. What does that have to do with gardening? Humor me. Your theory, your rules, remember? Robert was quiet for so long that Bella thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, just as she was about to give up, he spoke. I still sleep with a nightlight, he said quickly, as if saying it fast would make it less embarrassing. Not because I'm afraid of the dark, but because when I was 8, my parents died in a car accident, and I spent 3 months thinking they might come back if I left a light on for them. Bella's heart clenched. Robert, it's ridiculous, I know. I'm 32 years old, and I have a nightlight shaped like a sailboat that my mother gave me. Without thinking, Bella reached out and covered his hand with hers. It's not ridiculous. It's sweet. The moment their skin touched, something extraordinary happened. The tiny green bud they'd been examining seemed to shimmer, and then, impossible as it seemed, it grew. Just a fraction of an inch, but definitely, unmistakably grew. They both stared at it in stunned silence. Did that just... Bella started. Did you see... Robert whispered. They looked at each other, then back at the plant, then at each other again. Okay, Bella said slowly. Either we're both having the same hallucination, or your emotional gardening theory isn't as crazy as I thought. Robert's face lit up with the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. It transformed his entire appearance, making him look younger and infinitely more approachable. It worked, he breathed. It actually worked. Don't get too excited, Bella warned, though she was grinning too. One tiny bud doesn't make a garden. We've got about 40 acres of dead plants to deal with. Then we'd better get started. Robert stood up and offered her his hand. I have a feeling this is going to require a lot more honesty than either of us is comfortable with. As Bella let him pull her to her feet, she couldn't help but notice that his hand was warm and strong, and that he didn't let go immediately. She also couldn't help but notice that somewhere in the distance, she could swear she heard the faint sound of birdsong for the first time since she'd arrived. "Bring it on," she said, surprised by how much she meant it. "Let's save this garden." The sun was fully up now, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. And if Bella wasn't mistaken, the dead garden looked just a tiny bit less dead than it had the day before. 3 days later, Bella had discovered several important facts about emotional gardening. First, it was exhausting. Apparently, coaxing plants back to life through heartfelt conversations required the emotional stamina of a therapist and the physical endurance of an Olympic athlete. Second, Robert was a control freak who had opinions about everything from the optimal angle for morning sunlight exposure to the proper pH level for emotional soil enhancement. And third, she was starting to look forward to their dawn sessions in a way that had absolutely nothing to do with $50,000. "The delphiniums are responding well to discussions about childhood pets," Robert announced, consulting a leather notebook where he'd been meticulously recording their progress. "But the lavender seems to prefer conversations about embarrassing moments." Bella paused in her weeding of what was slowly becoming a functional herb garden. "Are you seriously categorizing plants by their emotional preferences?" "Scientific observation is key to understanding the phenomena we're witnessing," Robert replied with the kind of seriousness most people reserved for discussing national security. "Right." Bella sat back on her heels and wiped sweat from her forehead. "And what about those tomato plants we started yesterday? What do they prefer talking about?" Robert's face went slightly pink. "We haven't established their conversational preferences yet. That's because you clammed up completely when we got to them," Bella pointed out. "The second I asked you to tell them about your first kiss, you suddenly needed to check on the soil pH levels. The soil pH levels are very important. Robert?" Bella stood up and faced him, hands on her hips. "We made a deal. Honesty for plant growth. You can't pick and choose which truths you're comfortable sharing." "I can if the truths are irrelevant to horticulture." "Everything is relevant to horticulture when you're doing emotional gardening." Bella threw her hands up in exasperation. "Besides, those tomato plants are barely hanging on. They need some serious emotional nutrition, and your first kiss story might be exactly what they need." Robert looked like he'd rather eat dirt than continue this conversation. "My first kiss is not... it's not a pleasant memory." Something in his tone made Bella soften her approach. She walked over to where he stood rigidly beside the struggling tomato plants, their yellowing leaves drooping despite perfect growing conditions. "Okay," she said gently. "Tell me why." For a moment, she thought he was going to refuse again. Then he sighed and sat down heavily on the ground next to the tomatoes, not caring that his expensive jeans were getting dirty. "I was 14. He began reluctantly. "There was this girl in my boarding school, Amanda Fitzgerald. She was beautiful, popular, everything a teenage boy thinks he wants. She'd been flirting with me for weeks, and I was convinced I was in love with her." Bella settled down beside him, careful not to sit too close. "Sounds promising so far." "She asked me to meet her in the school garden after dinner one evening. Said she had something important to tell me." Robert picked up a handful of soil and let it fall through his fingers. "I spent the entire day imagining what it would be like to kiss her. I even practiced on my pillow." Despite the melancholy in his voice, Bella had to bite back a smile. "We've all been there." When I got to the garden, she was there waiting with 3 of her friends hidden behind the hedge. The moment I leaned in to kiss her, they all jumped out with cameras, laughing. Turns out it was a bet. They wanted to see if the weird rich kid was as pathetic as they thought. Bella's heart clenched. "Oh, Robert." The pictures ended up in the school newspaper with the headline, "Storm Warning, Danger of Social Awkwardness." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I learned that day that people would always see my money before they saw me, and that I couldn't trust my own judgment about who was worth caring about." As he spoke, something amazing happened. The drooping tomato plants began to straighten, their yellow leaves slowly shifting to a healthier green. New buds appeared on the stems, as if someone had hit fast forward on their growth cycle. "Robert," Bella whispered, pointing at the plants. "Look." His eyes widened as he watched the transformation. "They're responding to emotional pain." "They're responding to emotional truth," Bella corrected. "Pain, joy, whatever it is, they seem to grow when you're being genuinely honest about your feelings." "That's..." Robert stared at the thriving tomato plants. "That's actually fascinating from a botanical perspective. If plants can indeed sense and respond to emotional authenticity, it could revolutionize our understanding of..." "Robert." "Yes?" "You're doing it again." "Doing what?" "Hiding behind science when things get too real." Bella turned to face him fully. "What happened with Amanda was awful, and it clearly affected how you approach relationships. You don't have to analyze it like a research project." Robert met her eyes, and for a moment, his carefully constructed walls seemed to crack. "It's easier to analyze than to feel." "I know," Bella said softly, "but easy doesn't make gardens grow." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the newly revitalized tomato plants sway gently in the morning breeze. Then Bella had an idea. "Your turn to ask me something," she said. "Fair's fair. I don't need to know about your personal life to maintain professional boundaries." "Oh, for the love of..." Bella stood up and brushed dirt off her knees. "Fine. I'll just tell you anyway. My first kiss was with Tommy Morrison behind the gym when I was 15. It was terrible. Too much tongue, not enough coordination, and his braces got caught on my lip. But you know what? I didn't let it ruin kissing for me forever." She started walking toward the next section of garden, then turned back to find Robert staring after her with an unreadable expression. "The difference between you and me," she continued, "is that I decided one bad experience didn't define all future experiences. You decided it did." "That's not..." "Isn't it?" Bella challenged. "You've spent 18 years assuming that everyone who shows interest in you must have ulterior motives. When was the last time you let someone get close enough to prove you wrong?" Robert opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Finally, he said quietly, "Vivian was supposed to prove me wrong. And when she didn't, you decided the problem was with love itself instead of just with her." Before Robert could respond, Mrs. Henderson appeared at the edge of the garden, carrying a tray of sandwiches and looking thoroughly pleased with herself. "Lunchtime," she called cheerfully. "And my goodness, look at those tomatoes. They've grown 3 inches since yesterday." As she set the tray down on a nearby garden table, she caught sight of Robert's face and her expression grew concerned. "Everything all right, dear?" "Fine," Robert said automatically, but his voice was strained. Mrs. Henderson looked between them, clearly sensing the tension. "Well," she said diplomatically, "I'll just leave these here and let you two get back to your gardening." After she left, Bella picked up a sandwich and took a bite, studying Robert's profile as he stared intently at the thriving tomato plants. "For what it's worth," she said eventually, "I don't think you're weird or pathetic. I think you're scared. And there's a difference." Robert finally looked at her, and she was surprised to see something that might have been hope flickering in his amber eyes. "What if being scared and being right are the same thing?" he asked quietly. Bella smiled. "Then I guess we'll find out together, won't we?" As if in response to her words, a gentle breeze stirred through the garden, carrying with it the faint but unmistakable scent of blooming roses. 2 weeks into their emotional gardening experiment, Bella had learned to read the weather patterns of Robert's moods with the accuracy of a meteorologist. Sunny and cooperative meant the daffodils would practically dance. Cloudy with a chance of brooding usually resulted in spectacular growth spurts from the more dramatic flowers. But today felt different, like the atmospheric pressure before a hurricane. "The sunflowers aren't responding," Robert announced grimly, standing in front of a row of drooping yellow heads that looked like they were attending their own funeral. Bella set down her watering can and joined him. The sunflowers were indeed a disaster. Despite weeks of attention, they remained stubbornly limp and lifeless. Every other section of the garden was showing remarkable progress. The herb garden was flourishing. The rose gazebo was beginning to show tiny green buds, and yesterday they'd celebrated when the first tomato blossom appeared. But the sunflowers remained resolutely dead. Maybe they need a different approach, Bella suggested. What if we tried talking about something positive for once? You know, happy memories instead of childhood trauma. Robert's jaw tightened. I don't have many happy memories from childhood. Everyone has some happy memories. Not everyone had my childhood. There was something in his tone that made Bella study his face more carefully. She'd gotten good at reading his expressions over the past 2 weeks, but this was new, a kind of brittle defensiveness that made her think of thin ice over deep water. Robert, what aren't you telling me? I'm telling you everything relevant to the garden's recovery. Bull. Bella crossed her arms. We've been working together every day for 2 weeks. I've heard about your parents' death, your boarding school disasters, your failed engagement, and that time you threw up on your algebra teacher. But whenever I ask about anything before your parents died, you change the subject. Because it's not relevant, the sunflowers disagree. As if to emphasize her point, one of the sunflower heads drooped even further, a few dead petals floating to the ground like yellow tears. Robert stared at the dying flowers for a long moment, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet, Bella had to strain to hear it. My father didn't die in that car accident right away. Bella's stomach dropped. What? The story I tell people, that my parents died instantly in a car crash when I was 8. It's not exactly true. Robert sat down heavily on the garden bench they'd installed the week before. My mother died on impact. But my father, he lingered for 3 days in the hospital. Bella sat beside him, close enough to offer comfort, but not so close as to crowd him. Why didn't you tell me before? Because those 3 days were... Robert's voice cracked. Have you ever watched someone you love die slowly, knowing there's nothing you can do to stop it? No, Bella whispered. I sat by his hospital bed for 72 hours. The nurses kept trying to make me eat, sleep, go home. But I was convinced that if I left, if I stopped talking to him, he'd give up. So I told him everything I could think of. Every stupid thing that had happened at school, every book I'd read, every dream I had about what we'd do when he got better. Robert's hands were shaking now, and without thinking, Bella reached over and covered them with her own. On the 3rd day, he opened his eyes and looked right at me. Really looked at me, you know? And he said, Robert, you have to stop trying to save everyone. Some things can't be fixed, no matter how much love you put into them. Robert's voice broke completely. And then he died. The garden around them was completely silent except for the sound of Robert's ragged breathing. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. You were 8 years old, Bella said fiercely. You were a child trying to save your father. There's nothing wrong with that. Isn't there? Robert looked at her with eyes full of pain. Because I've been trying to save things ever since. Dead gardens, failed relationships, broken trust. Maybe my father was right. Maybe some things can't be fixed, no matter how much love you put into them. And maybe, Bella said softly, your father was wrong. As the words left her mouth, something extraordinary happened. The drooping sunflowers around them began to move, not quickly, but unmistakably. Their heavy heads slowly lifted, turning toward the morning sun like they were waking up from a long sleep. Petals that had been brown and brittle suddenly brightened to brilliant yellow. In the space of a few minutes, the entire row transformed from funeral parlor to celebration. They both stared in amazement. I don't understand, Robert breathed. I just told you about failure, about giving up. Why would that make them grow? Bella stood up and walked over to the nearest sunflower, which was now standing tall and proud, its face turned toward the sky. Because, she said, understanding flooding through her, you didn't give up. You're still here, still trying to save things, still putting love into broken places. The sunflowers aren't growing because you talked about failure. They're growing because you talked about never stopping trying, even when it hurts. Robert joined her beside the transformed flowers. That's ridiculous. I fail at everything I try to fix. Do you? Bella gestured around the garden, which was now a riot of color and life compared to the dead wasteland she'd found 3 weeks ago. Because from where I'm standing, you seem pretty good at bringing dead things back to life. For the first time since she'd known him, Robert smiled. Not one of his careful, controlled, almost smiles, but a real one that reached his eyes and transformed his entire face. I had help, he said, looking directly at her. The moment stretched between them, warm and full of possibility. Bella found herself stepping closer, drawn by something in his expression she'd never seen before. Hope, maybe, or trust, or something that made her heart beat faster. "Robert," she started to say, but before she could finish the thought, her phone rang. The spell broken, they both stepped back awkwardly. Bella fumbled for her phone, glancing at the caller ID with annoyance that quickly turned to confusion. "Cordelia Whitmore?" she answered. "Mrs. Whitmore, hi. Is everything—" "Miss Hope, dear, I have wonderful news." Cordelia's champagne voice bubbled through the speaker. "I've just spoken with the Ashford family in Martha's Vineyard, and they're desperate for a landscaper. They've heard about your unique methods, and they're offering $60,000 for a 6-month project. Can you be there by Monday?" Bella's blood went cold. "I'm sorry, what? Isn't it marvelous? Of course, you'll have to leave the storm project immediately, but $60,000 for 6 months, it's the opportunity of a lifetime." Out of the corner of her eye, Bella saw Robert go very still, his face shuddering closed like someone had flipped a switch. "Mrs. Whitmore," Bella said carefully, "I'm not finished with Mr. Storm's garden yet." "Oh, my dear, don't worry about that. Gardens are just gardens after all. But the Ashfords are old money, real society. This could establish your entire career." Bella looked at Robert, whose expression was now completely unreadable. The sunflowers around them swayed gently in the breeze, their bright faces turned toward the sun, testament to the miracle they'd just shared. I'll call you back," she said, and hung up. The silence that followed was deafening. "You should take it," Robert said finally, his voice flat and businesslike. "Robert, $60,000 for 6 months. That's better than what I'm paying you. It's not about the money, isn't it?" Robert's walls were back up, higher and stronger than ever. "This was always temporary, Bella. A 3-month contract. Nothing more." But as he walked away toward the mansion, leaving her alone among the sunflowers, Bella could have sworn she saw some of the newly bloomed petals beginning to wilt. Bella didn't see Robert for the rest of the day, or the next day, or the day after that. By Thursday morning, she was ready to storm the mansion and drag him out by his perfectly styled hair. The garden was suffering from his absence, not dramatically, but enough that she could see the difference. The roses around the gazebo had stopped their upward climb. The herbs seemed less vibrant. Even the triumphant sunflowers looked slightly droopy, as if they were missing their primary source of emotional nutrition. "He's being ridiculous," Bella announced to Mrs. Henderson, who had taken to bringing her tea and sympathy every afternoon. "He's being Robert," Mrs. Henderson corrected, settling into the garden chair they'd placed under the now flourishing apple tree. "When he's hurt, he disappears. Always has, even as a child." "Well, he's not a child anymore," Bella said, aggressively deadheading a perfectly healthy marigold. "He's a grown man who's acting like a spoiled brat." "Is he?" Mrs. Henderson's tone was carefully neutral. "Or is he acting like someone who's spent his entire life watching people leave?" Bella's hand stilled on the flowers. "I never said I was leaving. Didn't you? Because from what I understand, you haven't called Mrs. Whitmore back to decline that job offer either." The words hit like a slap. Bella had been telling herself she was keeping her options open, being practical, thinking it through. But the truth was, she'd been paralyzed by the magnitude of the choice in front of her. Stay with Robert and risk her heart on a man who might never be able to love her back, or take the safe path, More money, better career prospects, no emotional complications. It's not that simple, she said weakly. Isn't it? Mrs. Henderson's voice was gentle but firm. Bella, dear, I've watched that boy, and yes, he's still a boy in many ways, build walls around his heart for 24 years. You're the first person who's ever made him want to tear them down. Don't you think that's worth fighting for? Before Bella could answer, the sound of a car door slamming echoed from the front of the mansion. Both women turned to see a sleek red convertible parked in the circular drive, and a woman walking toward the house with the kind of confidence that could only come from money, beauty, or both. Oh no, Mrs. Henderson muttered. Who is that? Vivian Ashford. Bella's stomach dropped. As in the Ashfords who offered me the job. The very same. Robert's ex-fiancée. Mrs. Henderson stood up, her face grim. This is not good timing. They watched as Vivian, because of course she was stunning, with perfectly blonde hair and the kind of figure that made designer clothes look effortless, disappeared into the mansion. I have to go, Bella said, already moving toward the house. Bella, wait. But she was already running, her heart pounding with a mixture of panic and determination. She burst through the mansion's front door and followed the sound of voices to Robert's study, where she found him standing rigidly behind his desk, while Vivian lounged elegantly in the chair where Bella had sat on her first day. Simply devastated when I heard about your little gardening project, Vivian was saying, her voice like honey over broken glass. Though I must say, the improvement is remarkable. However did you manage it? Vivian. Robert's voice was carefully controlled. What are you doing here? Can't a girl visit an old friend? Especially when she has news. Vivian's smile was predatory. I'm engaged again, darling, to David Ashford. You remember David, Harvard, old money, that adorable yacht? We're planning the most divine wedding for next spring. Bella saw Robert's hands clench on the desk. Congratulations. Thank you. Which brings me to why I'm here. Vivian finally noticed Bella hovering in the doorway. Oh, you must be the landscaper. How charming. The dismissive tone made Bella's blood boil, but before she could respond, Vivian continued. David's family estate needs some work, and when I heard about your unique methods, well, I simply had to steal you away. $60,000, can you imagine? Of course it means leaving poor Robert here, but business is business. Actually, Bella started, but Vivian steamrolled over her. I do hope you understand, Robert. It's nothing personal. It's just that David's family moves in much more influential circles, the kind of people who can really make a career. She stood gracefully, smoothing down her designer dress. I'm sure you can find another gardener. After all, how hard can it be to water plants? The silence that followed was deafening. Bella looked at Robert, whose face had gone completely blank, the same expression he'd worn when he first told her about plants being dead. She realized with growing horror that Vivian had no idea what she'd just done, no understanding of the garden's true nature or what Robert had achieved here. You're right, Robert said finally, his voice eerily calm. How hard can it be? Exactly, Vivian beamed. I knew you'd understand. Miss Hope, shall we discuss the details in the car? I'm flying back to Martha's Vineyard this afternoon, and we really should get you settled in as soon as possible. Bella looked between them. Vivian standing there with casual cruelty, assuming everyone would bend to her will, and Robert retreating behind his walls so completely she could practically see him disappearing. No, she said quietly. Vivian blinked. I'm sorry? I said no. Bella stepped fully into the room, her chin raised. I'm not taking your job. Don't be ridiculous. $60,000? I don't care if it's $6 million. Bella's voice grew stronger with each word. I'm not leaving. She turned to Robert, whose carefully blank expression had cracked just enough to show a flicker of surprise. I'm not Vivian, she said directly to him. I don't care about your money or your connections or what other people think about working for you. I care about you, and I care about this garden. and I'm not going anywhere until we finish what we started." Vivian's laugh was sharp and incredulous. "How terribly romantic. But really, Miss Hope, you're being quite foolish. A man like Robert, well, he's not exactly known for his emotional availability. Maybe that's because no one ever stayed long enough to find out what he's really like," Bella shot back. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Robert walked slowly around his desk until he was standing directly in front of Bella. "You're sure?" he asked quietly. "I'm sure. Even though I've been acting like a spoiled brat?" Despite everything, Bella smiled. "Especially because you've been acting like a spoiled brat. Someone needs to call you on your drama queen tendencies." For the first time in 4 days, Robert's mouth quirked upward in an almost smile. "Drama queen?" "Total drama queen, the sunflowers told me." "Well," Vivian said coldly, standing up and gathering her purse. "This is all very touching, but you're making a terrible mistake, Miss Hope. Robert doesn't know how to love people. He only knows how to collect them." "Vivian." Robert's voice was quiet but firm. "Leave." "Gladly." She walked toward the door, then paused and looked back. "When you realize what you've given up for this little fantasy, don't say I didn't warn you." After she left, the silence in the study felt different, not awkward or tense, but full of possibility. "So," Robert said finally, "you're staying." "I'm staying." "Even though I disappeared for 4 days like a coward?" "Even though." Bella stepped closer. "But if you ever do that again, I'm going to sick the roses on you." "They're getting quite aggressive with their thorns." Robert's laugh was surprised and genuine. "Noted." Through the window they could see Vivian's red convertible pulling away. As it disappeared down the drive, something remarkable happened in the garden visible beyond. Every flower, every tree, every blade of grass seemed to straighten and brighten, as if the entire landscape had suddenly taken a deep, relieved breath. "Look," Bella whispered, pointing outside. Robert followed her gaze and his eyes widened. The garden was practically glowing with health and vitality, more beautiful than either of them had ever seen it. "It's like the whole garden knew she didn't belong here," he said in wonder. "Maybe it did." Bella looked up at him, her heart hammering in her chest. "Robert?" "Yes?" "Next time someone offers me a better job, just ask me to stay. Don't assume I'll leave." "And if I ask you to stay?" Bella smiled. "Then I guess you'll have to wait and see what I say." Outside, the garden bloomed in the afternoon sun, more alive and beautiful than it had ever been. 3 weeks before Bella's contract was supposed to end, Mother Nature decided to throw her own dramatic plot twist in the form of the worst thunderstorm the Hamptons had seen in a decade. Bella woke to the sound of rain hammering against her windows and wind howling like a banshee with commitment issues. She pressed her face to the glass and her heart sank. The garden looked like it was under siege, plants bent nearly horizontal, petals scattered like confetti after a very violent party, and the gazebos climbing roses whipping around like they were auditioning for a disaster movie. She threw on her rain gear and ran outside, where she found Robert already surveying the damage with the grim expression of a general watching his army retreat. "How bad is it?" she shouted over the wind. "The sunflower section is completely flattened," he called back. "Half the tomatoes are uprooted, and the herb garden looks like it went 10 rounds with a food processor." A particularly vicious gust of wind chose that moment to snap one of the apple tree's main branches, sending it crashing down onto the carefully tended flower bed below. "We have to get them inside," Bella yelled, already moving toward the most vulnerable plants. "Are you insane? You'll get yourself killed." Better than watching 3 months of work get destroyed. For the next 2 hours, they worked like people possessed, rescuing what plants they could and moving them to the mansion's conservatory. They were both soaked to the skin within minutes, but neither of them stopped. Robert carried armloads of potted herbs, while Bella carefully extracted the healthiest rose cuttings. Mrs. Henderson appeared periodically with towels and hot coffee, clucking at them like a mother hen but helping nonetheless. By the time they'd saved what they could, The conservatory looked like a refugee camp for plants, and both Bella and Robert looked like they'd been through a washing machine set to hurricane. "I look like a drowned rat," Bella said, wringing water out of her hair as they stood among the displaced greenery. "You look beautiful," Robert said quietly. The words hung in the air between them, more shocking than the thunder still rumbling outside. Bella looked up to find Robert staring at her with an expression she'd never seen before, open, vulnerable, and completely sincere. "Robert, I know this is terrible timing," he continued, pushing his wet hair back from his face. "We're standing in a room full of half-dead plants after nearly getting killed by flying tree branches. But I can't keep pretending I don't feel—" A tremendous crack of thunder interrupted him, followed immediately by a flash of lightning that lit up the entire conservatory. In that moment of brilliant illumination, surrounded by the plants they'd rescued together, Bella saw everything clearly. "I love you too," she said simply. Robert blinked. "I didn't actually say." "You were going to. Was I that obvious?" Bella laughed, stepping closer until they were almost touching. "Robert, you've been obvious since the day I told you your garden needed emotional honesty. You think I stayed for the landscaping? You stayed for me. I stayed for you." This time, when Robert leaned down to kiss her, there were no interruptions, no phone calls, no ex-fiancés, no dramatic weather events, just the two of them and the gentle sound of rain against the conservatory windows. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Bella noticed something extraordinary. The plants around them, the rescued refugees from the storm, were glowing. Not literally, but with a vibrancy and health that was almost supernatural. Flowers that had been wilted and broken were standing straight. Leaves that had been torn were somehow whole again. "Look," she whispered, pointing around them. Robert's eyes widened as he took in the transformed conservatory. "They're responding to us." "They're responding to love," Bella corrected. "Real love. The kind that makes you risk your life saving tomato plants in a thunderstorm." "Is that what this is?" Robert asked softly, his arms still around her waist. "Real love? What do you think?" Instead of answering with words, Robert kissed her again, deeper this time, with all the emotion he'd been holding back for months. Around them, the rescued plants seemed to glow even brighter. When they broke apart again, they were both laughing. "Mrs. Henderson is going to be insufferable about this," Robert said, pressing his forehead against hers. "About what?" "She's been betting with the mailman about when we'd finally figure it out. I think she had money on before the contract ends." "Smart woman." Bella smiled up at him. "Speaking of the contract," Robert's expression grew serious. "Bella, I know it's supposed to end in 3 weeks, but I don't want you to go. I want you to stay. Not as my employee, but as whatever you want to be. Partner in crime, co-conspirator in emotional gardening, girlfriend who keeps me from being a drama queen. How about all of the above? All of the above works for me." They might have stayed there kissing among the rescued plants forever, but Mrs. Henderson chose that moment to appear in the conservatory doorway with a tea tray and the biggest smile Bella had ever seen. "Well," she announced cheerfully, "it's about time. Mrs. Henderson," Robert warned, but he was smiling too. "Don't you Mrs. Henderson me, young man. I've been waiting for this moment for months." She set down the tea tray and looked around at the glowing plants. "Though I must say, your timing is impeccable. Look at this place. It's like a fairy tale." As if summoned by her words, the storm outside began to subside. The thunder grew distant, the rain gentled to a soft patter, and weak sunlight began filtering through the conservatory windows. "We should check on the garden," Bella said reluctantly. "The garden can wait," Robert said firmly. "Right now, I want to sit here with you and drink tea and pretend that thunderstorms always end with declarations of love." "They don't?" "In my experience, thunderstorms usually end with property damage and insurance claims." Bella laughed. Well, then I guess we're rewriting the rules. I like rewriting rules with you. As they settled onto the conservatory's wicker settee, surrounded by rescued plants and the fading sound of rain, Bella couldn't help but think that 3 months ago, she'd been a struggling landscaper with a mountain of debt and no prospects. Now she was a woman in love with a man who believed in emotional gardening and magic plants, and somehow, impossibly, it all made perfect sense. "Robert," she said, curling up against his side. When we go back outside, and the garden is completely destroyed, what are we going to do?" Robert was quiet for a moment, considering. Then he smiled, one of his real smiles that transformed his entire face. "We're going to rebuild it," he said simply. "Together. And this time, we'll plant it with love from the very beginning." Through the conservatory windows, the sun was breaking through the clouds, painting the storm-washed world in gold and silver. And if Bella wasn't mistaken, she could already see tiny green shoots pushing up through the mud in the garden beyond, the first signs of new growth, new beginnings, and new possibilities. 6 months later, Bella stood in the center of what had once been a dead garden and marveled at the miracle surrounding her. The storm had indeed destroyed much of their original work, but what they'd rebuilt together was beyond anything she could have imagined. The roses around the gazebo didn't just climb. They cascaded in waterfalls of red, pink, and white blooms that seemed to glow with their own inner light. The sunflowers had grown to impossible heights, their faces tracking the sun like devoted worshippers. The herb garden was so lush that Mrs. Henderson complained about running out of recipes that could use all the basil, rosemary, and thyme. But the real masterpiece was the new section they'd added, a circular garden bed surrounding an antique fountain that Robert had discovered in the mansion's storage. They'd planted it entirely with flowers that bloomed in the language of love. Red roses for passion, white jasmine for eternal devotion, purple irises for messages of the heart, and yellow daffodils for new beginnings. "It's ready," Robert announced, emerging from behind the gazebo where he'd been making mysterious preparations all morning. "Ready for what?" Bella asked, though her heart was already beginning to race. Robert had been acting suspiciously secretive all week, disappearing for mysterious phone calls and whispering with Mrs. Henderson in corners. For this. Robert walked to the center of the love garden and got down on one knee. Bella's hands flew to her mouth. "Robert, you're not—" "I am." He pulled out a ring box that looked like it had been crafted by fairy godmothers and opened it to reveal a vintage engagement ring with a diamond surrounded by tiny emeralds shaped like leaves. "Bella Hope, you brought my garden back to life. But more than that, you brought me back to life. You taught me that love isn't about collecting people or keeping them safe in glass houses. Love is about growing together, weathering storms together, and building something beautiful from the ground up." Tears were streaming down Bella's face as he continued. "You're the most honest, brave, infuriating, wonderful woman I've ever met. You argue with my scientific theories, you call me a drama queen when I'm being impossible, and you risk your life to save tomato plants in thunderstorms. Will you marry me?" Around them, the garden seemed to hold its breath. Even the birds had stopped singing, as if all of nature was waiting for her answer. "Yes," Bella whispered. Then louder, "Yes, you ridiculous, wonderful man, of course I'll marry you." The moment she said yes, something extraordinary happened. Every flower in the garden burst into simultaneous bloom. Roses that had been tight buds unfurled into perfect blossoms. Daffodils that weren't due to bloom for months pushed up through the earth in brilliant yellow profusion. The air filled with the most incredible fragrance, sweet, complex, and utterly magical. As Robert slipped the ring onto her finger and pulled her into his arms, Bella laughed through her tears. "I think the garden approves. I think the garden has been planning this longer than I have," Robert murmured against her hair. "I swear the roses have been dropping hints for weeks." Mrs. Henderson chose that moment to emerge from behind the apple tree, where she'd apparently been hiding with a camera and a bottle of champagne. "About time," she called out, popping the cork. I was beginning to think I'd have to lock you two in the conservatory until you figured it out." "Mrs. Henderson," Robert called. "Did you know about this?" "Know about it? I helped plan it. Someone had to make sure you didn't propose in the compost pile or something equally unromantic." As they celebrated with champagne among the impossibly blooming flowers, Bella couldn't help but think about how much had changed since that first morning when she'd thought Robert was crazy for believing in emotional gardening. Now she knew the truth. Plants really did respond to love, but only when that love was real, honest, and deep enough to weather any storm. "So," Robert said, his arm around her waist as they watched the sunset paint the garden in shades of gold and pink, "what do you think about a spring wedding?" "I think," Bella said, looking around at their magical garden, "that this place will be ready for it." 1 year later, the wedding of Bella Hope and Robert Storm was featured in 3 different gardening magazines, not because it was lavish or expensive, but because no one could explain how they'd managed to get every single flower in the 5-acre garden to bloom simultaneously in early May. The guests, a carefully curated group of people who genuinely cared about the couple rather than their social status, wandered through gardens that looked like something from a fairy tale. The ceremony itself took place in the white gazebo, now completely covered in climbing roses that had somehow arranged themselves into perfect heart shapes. Bella walked down an aisle of sunflowers that had grown in precise rows overnight, wearing her grandmother's simple white dress and carrying a bouquet that had literally grown itself. The flowers had simply appeared in her room that morning, stems twisted together in perfect arrangement, as if the garden itself had wanted to contribute to her wedding day. Robert, standing at the altar in a simple black suit with a single white rose from their very first rescued bush pinned to his lapel, looked like a man who had found his way home after a very long journey. When the minister asked if anyone objected to the union, a light breeze stirred through the garden, and every flower turned toward the couple as if giving their blessing. Mrs. Henderson, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, whispered to the mailman, her guest for the day, "I told you they'd figure it out eventually. That garden's been playing matchmaker since the day she arrived." The reception was held on the lawn, under fairy lights strung between apple trees heavy with unseasonably early fruit. The wedding cake, a simple 3-tier vanilla confection decorated with real flowers, sat on a table surrounded by centerpieces that seemed to rearrange themselves when no one was looking, always showing their most beautiful angles. As the evening wound down and the last guests departed, Bella and Robert found themselves alone in their magical garden, dancing to music only they could hear. "Any regrets?" Robert asked, spinning her around so her dress flared out like a white flower. "Just one," Bella said seriously. Robert's step faltered. "What?" "I regret not kissing you that first day when you told me about emotional gardening. It would have saved us a lot of time." Robert laughed, pulling her closer. "Well, we have the rest of our lives to make up for lost time. The rest of our lives in a magic garden with a housekeeper who takes credit for our entire love story. Don't forget the plants that eavesdrop on all our conversations, and the roses that throw petals at us whenever we argue, and the sunflowers that literally turn their backs on us when we're being stupid." They danced in comfortable silence for a while, surrounded by the gentle rustling of leaves and the soft fragrance of night-blooming jasmine. "Bella," Robert said eventually. "Thank you." "For what?" "For seeing the magic in broken things. For staying when everyone else left. For teaching me that love isn't about keeping people. It's about growing with them." Bella stood on her tiptoes and kissed him softly. "Thank you for being worth staying for." As they kissed under the starlit sky, surrounded by their impossible garden, every flower in the place seemed to sigh with contentment. Somewhere in the distance, Mrs. Henderson was probably winning another bet with the mailman about how long it would take them to decide on children. But that, as they say, is another story. And in the garden of Robert and Bella Storm, there were always more stories waiting to bloom. The end.